July 1944, Normandy. German machine gunners watched in disbelief as American Sherman tanks, fitted with crude steel tusks welded from scrap metal, smashed straight through centuries-old hedgerows in under a minute, obliterating defensive positions that should have held for days. What took Wehrmacht engineers months to fortify was reduced to rubble by a solution invented not by generals or engineers, but by a sergeant with a welding torch. How did a simple field modification by one American NCO shatter Germany's most confident defensive strategy and reveal the fatal flaw in their entire military philosophy? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. July 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy stood like walls built by giants from an ancient time. These were not simple bushes or garden borders. They were living in fortresses, some of them 400 years old, maybe older. The French farmers who worked this land called it the bocage. Each field sat inside thick barriers of tangled roots, dense bushes, and packed earth that rose 12 to 15 feet high. The roots went down just as deep, twisted together like iron cables that had grown into the soil over centuries. A man could hide an entire squad inside one hedgerow. A tank could hide behind one and stay invisible until the enemy came within spitting distance. The Norman sun hung heavy in the summer sky, baking the earth until it cracked. Dust settled on everything. The smell of turned soil mixed with cordite and death. In every direction, the bocage stretched like a maze with no exit. From the air, it looked like a giant checkerboard drawn by a drunk man. Each square a different size, each one wrapped in its own green wall. The Americans had stormed the beaches on D-Day and pushed inland, but now they found themselves in a different kind of hell. This was not an open country where their tanks could race forward. This was close, brutal, suffocating warfare, where every field became its own battle. Oberst Hans von Luck stood in a command post, dug into the base of a particularly thick hedgerow, and allowed himself a thin smile. He was a veteran, weathered by years on the Eastern Front, and he understood defensive warfare the way a fisherman understands the sea. He had studied the bocage for weeks now, walked its fields, measured its angles, calculated its possibilities. What he found made him confident, perhaps the most confident he had felt since the invasion began. The terrain itself was worth 10 divisions. Every hedgerow was a natural bunker. Every field was a killing ground. Every gap between fields became a fatal funnel where American tanks would have to expose themselves. His men had transformed this ancient farmland into a masterpiece of defensive engineering. Machine gun nests sat tucked into the base of hedgerows with overlapping fields of fire. Mortars hid in the rear fields, their crews ready with pre-sighted coordinates for every possible approach. Panzerfaust teams waited in spider holes, invisible until the moment they needed to strike. Mines peppered the few gaps between hedgerows. Even the cows that still wandered some fields served a purpose, their presence suggesting safety where death waited instead. Von Luck had explained the mathematics to his officers just that morning. An attacking force needed at least a 3-to-1 advantage to overcome prepared defenders in normal terrain. In the bocage, that number jumped to 10-to-1, maybe higher. The Americans had numbers, yes, but numbers meant nothing when they could only bring forward 2 or 3 tanks at a time through narrow gaps. His men could destroy those tanks one by one, like shooting fish in a barrel. The Americans would learn what the Romans learned 2,000 years ago. Attacking through restricted terrain against a prepared enemy is suicide. The standard American approach had become predictable. First came artillery, thundering down on suspected positions, turning earth into geysers of dirt and shattered roots. Then came the infantry, advancing carefully, trying to spot the German positions.
Finally came the tanks, the pride of American industry, the Sherman tanks that rolled off assembly lines by the thousands. And this was where the Bocage became a German ally. To cross a hedgerow, a Sherman had to climb. The driver would gun the engine, the tank would tilt upward, treads clawing at the packed earth and roots. For 3, maybe 4 seconds, the tank's belly would be exposed, pointing almost at the sky. The belly armor on a Sherman was thin, barely thick enough to stop rifle bullets, nothing against a Panzerfaust or a well-aimed shot from a hidden anti-tank gun. Von Luck had watched it happen a dozen times. The American tank would climb, reach the top of the hedgerow, and then the Panzerfaust would streak out from some hidden position. The explosion would gut the Sherman from below. The tank would shudder, smoke would pour from every hatch, and if the crew was lucky, they would have a few seconds to bail out before the ammunition cooked off. Unteroffizier Klaus Schmidt crouched behind his MG-42 machine gun in a position his squad had spent 2 days perfecting. They had dug into the base of a hedgerow overlooking a field that the Americans would have to cross to advance. The field sloped slightly downward, which meant any tank approaching would be silhouetted against the sky. Schmidt had measured the distances with his eyes and marked them in his mind. 50 meters to the gap where they would enter, 75 meters to the middle of the field, the killing zone. His gun could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. The Americans called it Hitler's buzzsaw because of the sound it made, a sound like ripping canvas but 100 times louder. Schmidt had plenty of ammunition belts. He could afford to be generous. His loader, a young kid from Bavaria named Peter, kept checking the belts nervously. This was Peter's 3rd week at the front. He still flinched at artillery. He still looked scared, which was smart because fear kept you alive. Schmidt remembered his own first weeks in Russia. He had been scared too. Now he was just tired and careful. Scared got replaced by routine. You did your job, you stayed low, you survived another day. They heard the Americans before they saw them. The sound of tank engines, that distinctive rumble of the Sherman's radial engine, the same kind of engine that powered American bombers. The sound grew louder. Schmidt made a small gesture with his hand, and Peter went completely still. Down the hedgerow, other positions waited just as quietly. The Americans were coming.
3 Sherman tanks appeared at the far end of the field, moving in a loose column. Infantry walked alongside them, rifles ready, eyes scanning. Schmidt watched them through a gap in the foliage. Standard approach. They would move to the hedgerow, stop, probably call for artillery. Then the lead tank would try to climb while the others provided covering fire. He had seen this dance before. He knew every step. But then something changed. Schmidt's eyes narrowed. The lead Sherman looked different. Something was attached to its front, metal tusks or prongs sticking out from the bow, crude things that looked like they had been welded on in a hurry. Farm equipment maybe, some kind of mine-clearing device? He did not understand what he was seeing. The Sherman did not stop at the base of the hedgerow. It did not pause. It did not climb. Instead, it accelerated, engine roaring, and charged straight at the hedgerow like an angry bull. The metal tusks hit first, biting into the ancient earth and roots. The tank kept coming, pushing, ripping, tearing through 400 years of growth. The hedgerow, which should have stopped the tank or forced it to climb, simply exploded into a shower of dirt and broken branches. In 30 seconds, maybe less, the Sherman had carved a gap wide enough for 2 tanks to pass through side by side. Schmidt felt his stomach drop. This was not supposed to happen. This was not in any defensive plan. Before he could react, before he could even swing his machine gun toward the gap, American infantry was pouring through, staying low, moving fast. The 2nd and 3rd Shermans were already pushing through behind the leader, their own strange tusks biting into what remained of the hedgerow. His carefully prepared killing zone, his perfect field of fire, had just been bypassed in less than a minute. Someone down the line opened fire too early, panicked shots that gave away their position. The American tanks swiveled their turrets and began pumping high-explosive rounds into the hedgerow where Schmidt and his squad waited. The world became noise and flying dirt. Peter grabbed the ammunition belts and ran. Schmidt ran too. There was no shame in it. You could not fight what you could not understand. The Americans had changed the rules, and in that moment, watching the Sherman smash through terrain that should have been impassable, Schmidt felt the first cold finger of real fear touch his spine. This was different. This was new. This was something they had not prepared for. In his command post, von Luck received the reports within the hour. Multiple positions overrun. Hedgerows breached in minutes instead of hours. American tanks with some kind of cutting device moving through the bocage like it was open country. He studied the descriptions, tried to understand what he was hearing. The Americans had modified their tanks in the field with scrap metal, and it was working. The reports kept coming, each one worse than the last. By the end of the first day, von Luck had accounts from 8 different defensive positions, all telling the same impossible story. The American tanks were cutting through hedgerows like farmers cutting wheat. What should have taken hours of fighting, what should have cost the Americans dozens of tanks and hundreds of casualties, was happening in minutes with losses the Germans could barely inflict. The mathematics of defense that von Luck had trusted, that every German officer had trusted, had been erased by chunks of welded steel. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The device itself looked crude when von Luck finally saw one up close on a destroyed Sherman. The metal prongs stuck out from the tank's bow like the tusks of some prehistoric beast. They were rough, uneven, clearly made in a hurry without precision tools or careful measurements. The welds were thick and ugly. Any German engineer would have been embarrassed to present such work. But ugly or not, the device worked. The prongs bit into earth and roots, the tank's weight and power did the rest, and hedgerows that had stood for centuries fell in seconds. The Germans called it different things at first. Some said the plow tank, others called it the Devil's Fork. But the name that stuck came from the Americans themselves. They called it the Rhino, and soon every Sherman in Normandy seemed to have one welded to its front. Von Luck tried to count how many modified tanks he was facing. 50? 100? The reports suggested hundreds. The Americans were producing these modifications faster than German intelligence could track them. What amazed von Luck, what kept him awake at night staring at maps that no longer made sense, was the speed. Not just the speed of the tanks breaking through hedgerows, but the speed of everything. From the first sighting of a rhino tank to widespread deployment across an entire army had taken what, 2 weeks? Maybe 3? In the German army, such a modification would require reports sent to Berlin, committees formed to study the problem, engineers brought in to design proper solutions, factories retooled to produce the approved design, and then months of testing before deployment. The American approach seemed to be, does it work? Yes? Then weld one on every tank we have. Go, now! Hauptmann Friedrich Weber commanded what was left of his company in a sector near Saarlouw. He had been a teacher before the war, history and literature, a man who believed in order and structure and the power of careful planning. The army had suited him. There were rules, procedures, chains of command that made sense. But the rhino tanks had shattered his sense of order as completely as they shattered his defensive positions. His company had held a cluster of fields for 6 days against conventional American attacks. They had fought well, used the terrain perfectly, made the Americans pay in blood for every meter. Weber had written careful after-action reports each evening, noting ammunition expenditure, enemy casualties estimated, and morale of his men. The reports were neat and professional. They made him feel like he was fighting a war that could be understood and therefore won. Then the rhinos came. 47 minutes. That was how long his position lasted once the modified Shermans arrived. 47 minutes from first contact to complete collapse. His machine gun nests, his carefully sighted mortars, his interlocking fields of fire, all of it became meaningless when the Americans simply drove through the hedgerows instead of climbing over them. Weber and 32 survivors retreated in chaos. The rest of his company was dead, wounded, or scattered. Now Weber sat in a temporary prisoner of war cage near Saint-Lô, a square of bare earth surrounded by barbed wire and bored American guards. The cage held maybe 200 German prisoners, men from a dozen different units, all captured in the same general offensive that had followed the Rhino breakthrough. They sat in small groups, talking quietly, smoking American cigarettes that the guards handed out with casual generosity that felt like an insult. Weber watched the American engineers working just beyond the wire. They had set up a welding operation right there in the field. 3 stations with portable generators powering electric welding equipment. Tanks rolled up, crude measurements were taken, and teams of soldiers began cutting and welding the metal prongs onto the tank bows. The work was loud, sparks flying in bright showers, the smell of hot metal drifting over the prisoner cage. Weber counted the tanks. In 2 hours, he watched 12 Shermans get modified. 12 tanks, 2 hours. The Americans were treating major vehicle modifications like an assembly line, like they were stamping out parts in a factory. What struck Weber most was who was doing the work. The welding crew included a black soldier, a man Weber had been taught to be inferior, incapable of technical work, evidence of America's racial weakness. Yet here he was, operating welding equipment with smooth confidence, making measurements, directing other soldiers. The welds looked just as crude and ugly as the ones on the destroyed tank von Luck had examined, but they held, they worked. That was all that mattered. Weber had believed what he was taught in training. America was soft, divided by race and class and weak democracy. Their army would fall apart under pressure because they had no true unity, no ideological strength, no warrior spirit. The Jewish influence had corrupted them. The mixing of inferior races had weakened them. Germans would win because Germans were simply better, more disciplined, more committed. The Rhino tanks proved all of it was lies. The Americans did not need warrior spirit. They had industrial capacity. They did not need ideological purity. They had practical problem-solving. They did not need perfect discipline. They had initiative and adaptation. A sergeant had invented the Rhino, not a general or an engineer or some party official. A regular soldier had looked at a problem, thought of a solution, and the American army had said, "Yes, good idea. Here is a welding torch and all the scrap metal you need." Weber watched another tank roll away from the welding station, fresh rhino tusks jutting from its bow, ready to tear through more hedgerows, to destroy more carefully prepared German positions. The tank crew looked relaxed, almost bored, like this was just another day at work.
And for them, it probably was. They would drive to the front, smash through some hedgerows, fight for a few hours, then come back for fuel and ammunition. Tomorrow they will do it again, and the day after, and the day after that. Because they had the fuel, they had the ammunition, they had the industrial base to keep this going forever. Weber sat with his back against a fence post, watching the clouds move across the Norman sky. The other prisoners talked among themselves, sharing rumors about where they would be sent, whether the war would end soon, whether their families back home were safe. Weber barely heard them. His mind kept returning to the same thought, turning it over and over like a stone in his hand. Everything he believed about the war, about Germany's superiority, about why they would win, had been built on sand. The Rhino tanks had washed that sand away, and now he could see the bedrock truth underneath.
It was ugly, and it was terrifying, and it was absolutely clear. He remembered a lecture from officer training 3 years ago that felt like 3 lifetimes. The instructor had been a veteran from the First World War, decorated and certain. He had explained why Germany would triumph in the coming conflict. German soldiers were better trained, better disciplined, better motivated. The German officer corps was professional, educated, steeped in military tradition going back to Frederick the Great. German doctrine was superior because it was based on decisive maneuver and the concentrated application of force. The Allies, especially the Americans, were racially mixed, ideologically confused, militarily inexperienced. They would crumble when faced with true warriors fighting for a unified vision. Weber had believed every word. He had needed to believe it because the alternative was unthinkable. If Germany was not superior, if the ideology was not correct, then what were they fighting for? What did the deaths mean? What did any of it mean? So he had pushed doubt away and focused on being the best officer he could be. He followed doctrine. He trusted the system. He believed in victory because the alternative was madness. The rhino changed everything. Not because it was a brilliant weapon or some technological marvel, it was neither of those things. It was crude, ugly, simple. A sergeant had invented it, Sergeant Curtis Cullen. Weber had learned his name from an American guard who seemed proud to share it. Not a general, not an engineer with years of training, a regular soldier who saw a problem and solved it with the materials he had available. And the American army had looked at his solution and said yes. They had not sent it up the chain of command for approval. They had not formed a committee. They had not waited for the perfect design. They had just started welding. That was the moment Weber's ideology cracked wide open. Because if a sergeant could change the course of a campaign, then the German system was fundamentally wrong. The whole structure of command, the careful hierarchy, the insistence that orders flow from the top down, all of it was too slow, too rigid, too stupid for modern war. The Americans had built an army that could think at every level. The Germans had built an army that could only think at the top, and the top was too far away from the actual problems. Weber thought about the black soldier working the welding equipment. He had been taught that black soldiers were inferior, that America's racial mixing made them weak. But that soldier could weld. He could measure. He could modify a tank. His race did not matter when the job needed doing. The American army used whoever could do the work, and they had so many people who could do the work that they could modify hundreds of tanks in a matter of weeks. Germany's obsession with racial purity meant they had fewer people, fewer skills, fewer solutions. They had limited themselves in the name of an ideology that the rhino proved was worthless. The propaganda had told Weber that Americans were soft, that they loved comfort too much to be good soldiers, that their democracy made them weak because they could not make hard decisions. But the rhino proved otherwise. The Americans made the hardest decision of all. They admitted their tanks couldn't handle the bocage. They looked for solutions anywhere they could find them, and they implemented those solutions immediately, even if they were ugly and crude. That took more strength than following orders. That took more courage than charging into machine gun fire. That took the courage to admit you were wrong and change. Weber understood now what he was really fighting. Not just American soldiers or British tanks or Soviet masses. He was fighting an idea, and the idea was simple and devastating. The idea was that regular people, if you gave them the tools and the freedom and the trust, could solve enormous problems. The idea was that initiative mattered more than obedience. The idea was that adaptation beat doctrine. The idea was that a good solution right now beat a perfect solution next month. And Germany had no defense against that idea, because Germany had built its entire system on the opposite belief. He thought about home, about his wife and daughter in Hamburg, about the apartment where he had graded student papers and planned lessons about the Roman Empire and the 30 Years' War. He had taught his students that history was shaped by great men, by generals and kings and visionaries who bent the world to their will through force of personality and brilliance of mind. He had been wrong. History was shaped by Sergeant Cullen and his welding torch. History was shaped by the collective intelligence of thousands of regular people, all solving small problems that added up to victory. The sun was setting over Normandy, turning the sky orange and pink. Beautiful, like the war had paused just to let everyone appreciate the evening. Weber knew the war had not paused. The war was grinding forward, eating positions and units and armies. The rhino tanks were probably out there right now, smashing through more hedgerows, destroying more carefully prepared defenses. And behind them would come more tanks, more soldiers, more supplies, more everything, because America had the capacity to just keep coming forever. Weber realized he was no longer afraid of dying. He was afraid of what came after, if he lived. He would have to go home and explain to his daughter why they had lost. He would have to tell her that everything they had been taught was a lie. He would have to help rebuild a country that had believed in the wrong things so deeply that millions had died for those beliefs. And the hardest part would be explaining that they had not lost to some Superman or wonder weapon.
They had lost to Sergeant Cullen. They had lost practical thinking. They had lost to an army that trusted its soldiers to be smart. Weber returned to Hamburg in the spring of 1947, nearly 2 years after the war ended. The ship that brought him and 500 other prisoners back across the Atlantic was a converted cargo vessel, cramped and cold, but nobody complained. They were going home. That was all that mattered. Or at least that was what they told themselves during the crossing. Weber stood at the rail as the ship entered Hamburg harbor and felt his stomach twist into a knot that had nothing to do with seasickness. The city was gone. Not damaged, not wounded. Gone. The Hamburg he had left in 1939 was a thriving port, streets full of people and cars, buildings tall and proud, the whole place humming with commerce and energy. The Hamburg he returned to looked like the surface of the moon. Block after block of rubble, buildings reduced to shells, entire neighborhoods flattened so completely that he could not even tell where the streets had been. The Allied bombing campaign had been thorough. The fires had been worse. Weber had heard about it in the prisoner camp, but hearing and seeing were different things. He stood at the rail and stared at his destroyed city and felt nothing. He was too tired to feel anything. The processing center was in a building that still had most of its walls. They gave him papers, a ration card, and directions to a displaced person's office that might know where his family was. The clerk who helped him was a woman in her 50s, thin like everyone else, wearing a coat that had been patched so many times it was more patches than original fabric. She looked up his name in a ledger, ran her finger down a list, and told him his wife and daughter were alive, living in the British sector in a shared apartment. She gave him an address. He thanked her and walked out into the cold. It took him 3 hours to walk across the city because the streets were still being cleared and he had to detour around rubble piles and unexploded bombs marked with warning signs. He passed people digging in the ruins, looking for anything useful, anything that could be sold or traded. Children played in bomb craters. Old women pushed carts loaded with salvaged bricks. Everyone looked thin and gray and exhausted. This was a victory for the Allies. This was a defeat for Germany. Weber thought about the prisoner camp, where he had eaten 3 meals a day, where the food was boring but plentiful, where nobody was starving. He thought about the contrast and felt sick. The apartment building was damaged but standing, 3 stories tall, with all its windows blown out and replaced with boards or paper. He climbed the stairs, his legs shaking from hunger and exhaustion and fear. What would he say to them? How could he explain where he had been, what he had learned, what it all meant? He knocked on the door, marked with the number the clerk had given him. He waited.
The door opened. His wife stood there, older and thinner, but alive and real. She stared at him for 3 seconds like she was seeing a ghost, and then she pulled him inside and held him so tight she could barely breathe. His daughter appeared from another room, 9 years old now, hardly recognizing him, but knowing somehow that this stranger was her father. They sat together on furniture that did not belong to them, in an apartment they shared with 2 other families, and Weber tried to explain 3 years of captivity in words that would not come. Over the following weeks, as he slowly adjusted to being home, to being hungry again, to living in a city that felt like a graveyard, Weber started talking. Not about the fighting, not about the friends he had lost. About the rhino tanks. About Sergeant Cullen and his welding torch. About the American capacity to just solve problems without asking permission. His wife listened patiently, not really understanding why this mattered so much to him. His daughter listened because she was curious about everything, still young enough to think the world made sense if you just paid attention. Weber found work eventually, teaching again, though the schools were makeshift affairs in damaged buildings with too few books and too many traumatized children. He taught history because that was what he knew, but he taught it differently now. He did not talk about great men shaping destiny. He talked about systems. He talked about how societies organized themselves, how armies structured themselves, how ideas about authority and initiative could determine who won and who lost. His students, many of them children of dead soldiers, children who had lost everything, listened with eyes that had seen too much. One evening in 1953, Weber sat with his daughter, now 15, helping her with schoolwork. She was studying the war, trying to understand how it had happened, why Germany had lost. She asked him the question directly, the way teenagers do when they are tired of adult evasion. "Why did we lose, Father? You were there. You fought. Why did we lose?" Weber put down his pen and looked at her. She had her mother's eyes, serious and searching. She deserved a real answer, not platitudes or propaganda or comfortable lies. He told her about the hedgerows of Normandy. He described how the bocage should have stopped the Americans for months, should have bled them white, should have given Germany time to regroup. He explained the defensive mathematics, the advantages of terrain, all the careful planning that went into creating an impenetrable barrier. And then he told her about the rhino. "We lost," he said, "because a sergeant had an idea and his army listened. We lost because the Americans built a military that trusted regular soldiers to think, to innovate, to solve problems without waiting for orders from Berlin. We lost because they could modify 500 tanks in 2 weeks, and we would have needed 6 months and a committee. We lost because our system required genius at the top and perfect obedience below, and their system assumed competence at every level." His daughter thought about this, frowning the way she did when working through a difficult problem. "But you were smart," she said. "You were an officer. You had training. Why could you not adapt too?" Weber smiled sadly. That was the question, was it not? That was the question that had haunted him for 8 years. "Because I was not allowed to," he said. "Because I was taught that my job was to follow doctrine, to execute the plan, to trust that the people above me knew better. When the rhino tanks appeared, I had no authority to do anything except report the problem up the chain of command and wait for a solution to come back down. By the time a solution might have arrived, the battle was over. The Americans won because they did not wait. They just acted."
"But that sounds like chaos," his daughter said. "How can an army work if everyone just does whatever they want?" "It is not chaos," Weber explained. "It is trust. The American system trusted that soldiers closest to the problem would make good decisions if given the tools and authority to do so. Our system trusted only the people at the top, and the people at the top were too far away to understand what was really happening. So we lost. Not because we were cowards, not because we did not fight hard enough. We lost because our philosophy of war was wrong. The years passed. Germany rebuilt slowly, painfully, transforming from ruins into something new. Weber continued teaching, watching his students grow up in a country that had to completely rethink what it believed. The old propaganda was gone, discredited by defeat and revelation. The camps had been discovered. The full horror of what had been done in Germany's name became impossible to deny. Weber had not known about the camps during the war, had not known the full extent of the evil that his country had committed. But ignorance was not innocence. He had believed in the system. He had served it. He had to live with that. But the lesson of the rhino stayed with him, became something he returned to again and again when trying to explain to students how it had all gone so wrong. The rhino was not just about tanks and tactics. It was about a fundamental difference in how societies organized themselves, how they valued individual initiative versus collective obedience, how they balanced authority with freedom. The Americans had found a way to combine both. Germany had chosen obedience over everything else, and obedience without wisdom led straight to hell. In 1960, Weber was invited to speak at a conference about military history. He was 63 years old, gray and tired, but still teaching, still thinking about the war. He gave a lecture about the Bocage campaign, about the defensive advantages that should have stopped the Allied advance. And then he showed them pictures of the rhino tanks, crude and ugly and effective. This, he told the audience, this is why we lost. Not because we lacked courage or skill or determination. We lost because a sergeant with a welding torch had more impact on the campaign than all of our generals combined. We lost because we built a system that could not adapt as fast as one American NCO could innovate. After the lecture, a young student approached him, earnest and confused. "But sir," the student said, "are you saying we should have no discipline, no structure, just let everyone do whatever they think is best?" Weber shook his head. "No," he said, "I am saying that discipline without initiative is paralysis. I am saying that a structure without flexibility is a cage. I am saying that the Allies won because they found a balance we never achieved. They had discipline when they needed it, and initiative when they needed that. We only had obedience, and obedience is not enough when the world changes faster than orders can flow down from the top." The student nodded slowly, still processing. "And you learned this from a tank with metal tusks welded to its front?" "Yes," Weber said. "I learned it from exactly that. The most important lesson of my life, learned in 47 minutes while my position collapsed around me. The rhino taught me that wars are not won by the side with the best doctrine or the purest ideology or the most obedient soldiers. Wars are won by the side that can adapt fastest to reality. And reality, in July 1944, was that the Bocage needed to be breached. Sergeant Cullen found a way. We did not. That is the entire story of the war in one simple fact." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.